All right. So thanks everybody for being here. My name is David Z. Morris, and welcome to everybody at home. I will just add to what Brooke said. I'm a former CoinDesk reporter back when it was good, and I spent a lot of time, in fact, I spent an entire month of my life sitting in the FTX criminal trial, Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal trial, and I wrote a book about it and all of the stuff happening with it. For those who don't know, one of the really incredible, all-time, I think, incredible crypto stories is that CoinDesk at the time of the FTX collapse was owned by Digital Currency Group, which was an umbrella company that included a trading shop called Genesis that got blown up when FTX went down and resulted in us getting sold to a much worse owner, who I will not name here because we're on a different topic. But I am going to read for hopefully about 10 minutes from the book, and to try and put it in the most sort of concrete, simple terms possible. And I know that especially because Polkadot is sort of Ethereum affiliated, there obviously is a certain amount of effective altruist sentiment still remaining in the Ethereum community. But the idea of my book, basically, the argument that I make is that the way of thinking that they advocate is both fundamentally flawed in that it excludes a lot of human knowledge that it actually turns out is very important, and that it's flawed in very specific ways motivated by the people who fund the movement, quite frankly, which does include some people in the Ethereum space. So, shots fired. This is a section from chapter 3 titled, "Was Sam Bankman-Fried Actually Smart?" My fascination with Sam Bankman-Fried is rooted in his completely unflappable, in some sense clearly sincere, and even impassioned belief in his own innocence. The persistence of this delusion is rooted in his too literal acceptance of utilitarian ethics, according to which he did nothing wrong. These tendencies matter more broadly because they attempt to grant the members of a defined circle of West Coast technologists the license to accumulate massive ethical and financial power under the rubric of future disasters that they claim the privilege of preventing. But equally fascinating is another contradiction. While his public profile and allure to investors was premised on his staggering intellect, Sam Bankman-Fried appears, according to all available evidence, to be a fucking idiot. That's obvious in retrospect in his business practices and the architecture of his fraud. Even if you're one of his apologists and take no issue with his spending of customer funds, you'd have to admit that his financial strategy was poor. His ignorance was on display in his dismissal of Anna Wintour's invitation to sponsor the Met Gala while handing $15 million to reality TV clown Kevin O'Leary. His compulsive video game addiction, despite Sequoia Capital's wishful thinking, was always a symptom of indiscipline, not excess bandwidth. Even his attempts to position himself as a thought leader in crypto seemed flimsy to knowledgeable insiders. Bankman-Fried is not biologically impaired. His facility with puzzles, math, and probability mean he likely would have scored quite high on an IQ test designed to measure instrumental reasoning. Nor was he raised in deprivation that robbed him of stimuli as a developing child, which, by the way, is his mother's theory of how all crime happens. She's a determinist. She believes that children raised poor are more likely to be criminals, which nominally a progressive stance, in fact, a little bit retrograde. Rather, Sam's blind spots were created in contradiction to the view of intelligence on which Stanford and Silicon Valley are premised by his learned rejection of the importance of learning, education, and expertise. His clumsy ignorance, ultimately, was not a fate to which he was damned. It was a choice enabled and supported by a community that has turned ignorance into a virtue on the basis of a view of intelligence hollowed out in the final account by eugenic racism. One striking glimpse of this self-willed idiocy was his confident dismissal of literature and of books more generally. And obviously I'm biased here. I'm reading from a book, so I didn't like this part of what he was about. Bankman-Fried had stopped reading books altogether by the time he reached 8th grade, although recent reporting suggests now that he's in prison, he's got a lot of free time, so he's reading again. stopped reading books altogether by the time he reached 8th grade, seemingly out of pique at his own incapacity for nuanced understanding. Quote, "I objected to the fundamental reality of English class," he told Michael Lewis. "I was being told I was wrong about a thing it was impossible to be wrong about. All the grading was arbitrary. I don't even know how you grade it." In the infamous Sequoia profile, Bankman-Fried says that, quote, "I would never read a book. I'm very skeptical of books. I don't want to say no book is ever worth reading, but I actually do believe something pretty close to that. I think if you wrote a book, you fucked up." I fucked up. And it should have been a 6-paragraph blog post. I do those too. The profile was a commercial hagiography of Sam, remember. Marketing copy, basically. So the dismissal of nuanced thinking, reflection, and complexity was a point in Bankman-Fried's favor to the people who had given him tens of millions of dollars. Bankman-Fried's proud ignorance was, if nothing else, consistent over time. "I could go on and on about the failings of Shakespeare," he wrote in 2012, at age 20, on a personal blog called Measuring Shadows. His conclusion wasn't based on Shakespeare's writing, but on population statistics. When Shakespeare wrote, almost all Europeans were busy farming. Few people were even literate, probably as low as about 10 million people, he wrote. What are the odds that the greatest writer would have been born in 1564? The Bayesian priors aren't very favorable. Why this aggressive disdain for Shakespeare? Knowing the deeper springs, quote, "knowing the deeper springs of human character is precisely why Shakespeare has been so central to the canon for so long," essayist Henry Oliver observed in response to Sam's unearthed comments. And perhaps that was exactly the problem. Barbara Fried's mechanistic determinism and Sam's own self-satisfied certainty were the load-bearing beams and girders of a resolute Philistinism. The depths of human character were not simply uninteresting to Sam. They were a challenge to his entire inherited worldview of humans and the universe as machines. The subjectivity that Bankman-Fried seemed to fear and hate would be more accurately described as subtlety and complexity, critical thinking, intellectual humility, confrontation with the unknown and unknowable. The objectivity that he and his fellow travelers clung to was just another word for his own hand-me-down beliefs, shop-worn and unquestioned. As smart as he managed to make it sound by chopping logic, Sam's dismissal of culture and art was a sophomoric rationalization of his own incuriosity. The chicken of ignorance, my wife's favorite line in this whole book, by the way, the chicken of ignorance, the refusal to absorb complexity, ultimately came home to roost in dramatic fashion. The most deeply revealing of Sam's multifarious missteps was his decision, after FTX halted and caught fire, to conduct an expansive media tour. Over the course of uncounted hours of podcast and television appearances, he didn't have much else to do, Bankman-Fried wove an alternate reality according to which FTX's leverage lending facility and banking arrangements transformed his embezzlement into mere naive sloppiness. While he certainly might have been convicted regardless of his decision, these media appearances were devastating for his defense. As soon as he opened his mouth, his lawyers were obliged to follow both the contour and detail of his assertions, or risk having prosecutors point out their contradictions. His legal team, almost certainly including his own parents, warned him of more or less this, giving him what he described in late 2022 as, quote, the classic advice, don't say anything, recede into a hole. In public, Bankman-Fried explained the choice to run his mouth in terms of ethical responsibility. Quote, I have a duty to talk to people. I have a duty to do everything I can to try and do what's right, end quote. But speaking to citizen journalist Tiffany Fong in late November of 2023, I'm forgetting the date here, he offered a different, truer-seeming account of his thought process. Quote, I don't think lawyers know what they're talking about. They know what they're talking about in the extremely narrow domain of litigation. They don't understand the broader context of the world, of which, Sam Bankman-Fried, obviously a very worldly man who understood everything. Bankman-Fried, in short, held lawyers in contempt and was certain he knew better than them. One wonders if that includes his parents. If his real goal with all this yapping was to help his victims, Bankman-Fried would have told the truth after the collapse. Instead, he not only lied, but constantly gestured to his poor memory and lack of access to data as insurance against the chance that his lies would be called out. This rhymes all too clearly with his passionate declaration that he never had a chief financial officer at FTX because the role's supposed purpose was, quote, a functional religion which, quote, people cannot articulate convincingly. The lack of a CFO, trumpeted as some heroic insight in the face of oppressive dogma, had the convenient payoff of leaving him free to pursue his utilitarian schemes. Claiming intellectual authority on one hand while cultivating obscurity and ignorance with the other is a hallmark of techno-utopian rhetoric more broadly. The rejection of expertise and norms is a shared tendency of many destructive public figures of our era. Bankman-Fried had a total disregard for professionals, for books in academia, for learning itself, unless it came in the form of a game or a bet he could win. We can trace this to the influence of Eliezer Yudkowsky's rationalism, and specifically the cultist faith in Bayesian reasoning and an effectively deterministic physical universe. The constant rationalist injunction to re-examine your priors and reason from first principles became, for Sam and for many rationalists, an excuse to ignore any and all received or expert knowledge. This is particularly striking in light of the major role Peter Thiel played in funding and legitimizing rationalism early on. Thiel has been a vocal critic of educational norms since writing The Diversity Myth with fellow white South African immigrant David Sachs. It would be difficult to imagine a more effective anti-education operation than rationalism if you were to design one from the ground up. Yudkowsky himself is a proud autodidact and denigrator of the academic establishment, and his movement's gravitational pull has drawn countless talented young Americans to a decidedly anti-humanist mode of thought. Rationalism furthers contempt for the complexity of the humanities in favor of a model of pure logic that approaches humanistic topics with a mimicry of so-called STEM methods. Undermining the humanities, both institutionally and culturally, was an agenda pushed by power elites starting no later than the late 1990s. This agenda has cleared the path for greater profit and power to flow to people like Thiel himself. And rationalism specifically has diverted the attention of thousands of passionate world changers away from history, politics, and real philosophy, and towards endless, groundless thought experiments about future artificial intelligence and the retreading of long understood logical fallacies. Without Thiel's cultivation of Yudkowsky, many more young people of Sam's ilk might have come to focus on current and measurable threats to human thriving, like climate change or economic inequality. At the very least, they might have placed more importance on learning from the real world, from experience, and from experts. Sam Bankman-Fried, even if we accept his own counterfactual version of events, might have been a little less confident about his own predictions of the future. Perhaps he wouldn't be spending the next 2 decades in prison. And we have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. Thank you. No, Anthony, you can't leave. You're supposed to ask a question. This is your duty.
All right, no, I know I'm feeling good. All right, cool. Is this working? Okay, great. So you've spent a lot of time with SBF, and you've probably spent more time with a lot of the documents than most people who followed it just through crypto Twitter. What would you say is one of the most common things that people get wrong in their understanding of the whole situation that differentiates someone who only followed on Twitter versus someone who sort of read the extra documents and read further?
Well, I actually would sort of redirect that slightly to say that the thing that I would most focus on is the false narrative that's being promoted by a lot of allies right now. And there's two elements to this false narrative. One is that the money borrowed by Alameda came out of a margin lending program. That is demonstrably and hugely false. Forensic accountants at trial showed that only, roughly like 20% of deposits on the exchange were enrolled in margin lending. And so it's just this amazing lie that they've completely continued to repeat again and again. The margin lending thing, false. If you ever hear that and you don't already know, it's complete bullshit. And I've written about, there was an appeals hearing last Monday, which was honestly hilarious because they paid a ton of money for one of the biggest appeals lawyers in the country to repeat this thing about the margin lending program and all of the other weird versions of reality that they've come up with. The other one that I would flag as a big misdirect, and that has been since the day after all of this happened, is a run on the bank. And I think probably a lot of people in this room right now know that FTX was not a bank, it was a custodian, and the user agreement that you signed was that they would not invest your money. And so the idea of a run on the bank being the cause of this, and this is one of the things that I write a lot about in the book, is that Sam Bankman-Fried he's brilliant at coming up with alternative explanations that are actually confessions. And in this case, the confession when he says run on the bank is, we were investing your money. That's why we couldn't get it out fast enough. And so he's admitting to a crime. He's admitting to fraud because he, stated, I think at least as early as 2020 in public, that we don't invest your money, and that was a lie. Bam, that was a lie. So those are the two things that I would definitely flag as the versions that people are trying to sell you and that you have to watch out for.
Hang on one second. Just hang on hold on one second. Right into that microphone.
Yeah. So I remember after he got arrested, the New York Times ran a glowing op-ed on how he's misunderstood. And that kind of led me to believe that the mainstream media was covering up for him or something. Is that true?
I think a lot of people felt that, and I think there are at least two very specific things that I can point to that are evidence of that. I mean, the most obvious one, and he's sort of media, sort of not, but Michael Lewis wrote this book, Going Infinite, which I don't know if people have read, but it is 250 pages of, it was a run on the bank and the money was always there. It is literally just a regurgitation of Sam Bankman-Fried's version of events. I mean, it's catastrophically embarrassing for this guy, because for anybody who doesn't know, Michael Lewis, very respected long-term financial journalist who got completely fucking hoodwinked. And I think that some of the mainstream media sort of bias was literally specifically trying to cover Michael Lewis's ass, because these people are he is the New York Times bestseller, so of course the New York Times is going to echo his version of the story. One of the things so there's this writer, Gideon Lewis Krauss at the New Yorker, and he pointed out two really good things about Michael Lewis in terms of his role in this, which is Michael Lewis has made his career writing about heroes who are doing counterintuitive things. And that includes Michael Berry, obviously, going back to The Big Short. Even when you talk about the IDX, the Flash Boys, I'm forgetting the name of the exchange there, but it's we're going to build a new exchange, it's going to be totally different. Obviously, FTX, new exchange, is going to be totally different. The funniest thing about Michael Lewis in all of this is that it actually exposed problems with his other work, including, does anybody know, am I correct, it's IDX was what Flash Boys was about? Nobody in the room knows, okay. So I think that's correct though, and it turns out that the story about IDX was not accurate. Apparently he really screwed up The Blind Side, which is another book by him, where he wrote the book as if this family had adopted a football player, but in fact they had only put him in a conservatorship that gave him access to all of their money, and They were friends of his from when Michael Lewis was a kid, the parents who like adopted this kid and like took all his money, and now the football player is suing his quote unquote parents. So like it blew up Michael Lewis's whole thing, which is frankly elite influence. The other thing that's quite connected to this that I wouldn't say is like a specific unethical thing, but it does highlight just how close all of these people are to each other, which is the sort of rookie reporter for the New York Times who covered the Sam Bankman-Fried trial, and who did say, he wasn't the author of the op-ed you might be referring to, but the New York Times reporting was often criticized for being a little bit sympathetic, including one of my biggest beefs and one of the other underlying lies here, where the investments, like, we stole your money, but we put it in Anthropic, so now it's worth a lot more. That's a big part of their defense, right? And the New York Times guy, David Yaffe Bellany is his name. This is gonna blow your minds. His uncle studied the exact same kind of philosophy that Barbara Fried specializes in at Stanford at a period where she was on staff. I do not have evidence that they had any interaction, but it seems extremely unlikely that they did not. So the main New York Times reporter covering this story has a family connection to Sam Bankman-Fried's family. So take that as you will. Other questions? Oh.
Hey, David, thanks a lot for speaking here. Really pleasant listening, so that was really nice.
My voice is one of my many gifts.
Your prose as well, though, really nice. I'm just wondering if you remember the point, maybe the red flag, where it occurred to you that it might be worth your time to really focus in and follow this story in the way that you did. Do you remember when you saw the writing on the wall?
No, it's actually pretty. So I've been a crypto reporter since 2014. So I've seen many centralized exchanges blow up. I understand the technology very well. From 2020 to 2021, I was a staff writer at Fortune, where I was actually mainly covering vaccine development. And I was also running the crypto newsletter, and so I was like vaguely aware of SBF. But frankly, I had seen, people in this room probably remember Quadriga CX, plenty of other centralized exchange blowups, and at the same time, centralized exchange technology is just not interesting. And so frankly, for me, I paid zero attention to SBF until it actually collapsed. And I was in the newsroom where people like Ian Allison were finding the balance sheets and doing that work ahead of time. But I mean, I was not one of those people. I came in afterwards, and specifically, somebody was mentioning this kind of mounting anxiety that the media was in the tank for SBF and maybe he was going to get off. And I think that was maybe a little bit overblown at the time, but there were reasons to be anxious. And so I wrote a column in like November 22nd of that year titled, "The FTX fraud was a crime, not an accident." And that was like a very badly needed message at that time, it turns out. I think that column, I've heard mixed things and I did not have access to the numbers, but I think that column might be one of, if not the most widely read thing CoinDesk ever published up to that point. And it's because there was this anxiety. There was this like, why is he not already arrested? And there were reasons behind the scenes for that. We did actually wind up having an exceptionally fast prosecution. So the conspiracy theories, I think, did not really wind up holding much water, but there were really good reasons for them, honestly, because we had, his mother was bundling donations to the Democratic Party at the time. This was during the Biden administration. It was not irrational to think that maybe he was being protected. And one of the things that I go into in the book is that there are also reasons to believe that there was a US intelligence component to this entire thing. And so that like adds to the anxiety that people had about maybe not. So like, to answer your question specifically, like I just came in after, frankly. And then I went to the trial, and in some ways I think it might have been advantageous to come in later, because I think like maybe a year after everybody else, I was like, oh wait, this guy's a fucking sociopath. He is like a complete psycho. And I think I realized that in some ways, like after a lot of people who were in the industry and had watched him and seen what he was doing. but I kind of like came to it fresh, and I was like, oh, I see. He's a maniac. and so I think that that was, in some ways, the fresh perspective was useful.
I have a question for you.
Please.
So curious with the more recent development of SBF's return to Twitter, if you have any inkling
let's fucking go, buddy.
of an underlying motivation there, or if it's pure hubris.
I mean, hubris is the right word for it, for sure. Because, and I mean, the real question for me is, where's the money coming from? Because there's the Twitter thing, which I would say there is like some signs of inorganic activity around public messaging. You might have seen, like, there's this account, Mr. Purple, which, according to my sources, is very specifically connected to the Bankman-Fried family. And so these are like just partisans out there, like putting out chaff, basically. And it's nothing new. It's still the money was always there. Ignore the terms of service. If you had just, like, this is the amazing thing, Bankman-Fried is like, if I had just had like a little more time, I would have been able to, and it's like, that's not how it worked, man. But the crazy thing is that the appeals lawyer, Andrea Shapiro, doesn't come cheap. And they clawed back all of the $10 million that was left over. They paid for the trial, by the way. The parents paid for the defense team with money stolen from FTX. That's just straight up what happened. And then they settled the clawback suit against them out of court. So the presumption is that they gave back all of the money they hadn't already spent. So there's a real question right now about how they're paying for Andrea Shapiro, how they're paying for maybe a paid social media campaign, certainly a PR-driven social media campaign. And so these are all open questions, but the good news is that, especially after having listened to the actual hearing in front of a Second Circuit appellate panel last Monday, they've got nothing. There is like no, like, I mean, the judges were literally laughing at the appeals lawyer during this hearing, and it was amazing. And I did a whole thread, and you guys should go find it. But it's, I think that like it is still scary, especially because of Trump, to think that like maybe he's going to get off. Because Trump is just pardoning every criminal he can find. But the real catch here, which I find, and I think this is actually maybe a good note to end on, the reason that Sam Bankman-Fried will never get a pardon is because he committed campaign finance fraud to hide all of his donations to Republicans, and then got on the magazine covers as like this Democratic mega donor. So yeah, the way you're smiling, that's how I feel like all the time. It's just fucking delicious. Like I have this like, because this guy just fucked himself. You know, he committed so much crime that he crimed his way out of a pardon. And I will say, since the hearing last Monday,
It's a great line.
yeah, I haven't seen, and admittedly I've just blocked them because they're clowns, but like I haven't seen as much of the free SBF stuff over the past 2 weeks specifically, and I think maybe it's because the appeals hearing went so bad that they might have just actually given up. So who knows?
Amazing. This was so good. I do have a really quick question. We will keep it just to a couple of words,
Please.
Which is very difficult
Hey,
for us.
I'll take as much stage time as you'll give me.
I mean, I'm exhausted. We're ready to be done. But the idea, I thought, of the effective altruism and that whole saga, like, do you see any kind of persistent red flags in the Web3 projects right now that like people should be more paranoid about?
I wouldn't say, I think that both SBF and EA in general specifically came to crypto because they thought it was easy money.
Yeah.
Like they're not at all interested in any of the
Right.
values or principles or anything like that. And
Right.
Frankly, I think that effective altruism still has presence in the space, as I sort of nodded to, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are people here who hang on to that. And I would emphasize that, like, this is why the book is important, because effective altruism at its core is actually pretty good, pretty okay.
Yeah,
the
I
basic
agree.
point is like we live in the Western developed world and we have a lot of money, and we should think of that as having greater impact when we give it away. But that's not what effective altruism is about anymore, and I won't give you the full answer because it's
Go look
a
it
whole
up.
other, it's part of the book, but like all they're worried about right now is like artificial intelligence turning into Terminator and killing us all.
Yeah.
That is like the main focus of effective altruism, effective altruist funding. They're totally entwined with rationalism, and it's all ridiculous, frankly, to be perfectly blunt.
It is.
And so like, I think that the one thing that I would flag is that Ezra Klein, who was a co-founder of Vox with Matthew Iglesias, is now the face of this thing called abundance, which, I don't know what everybody's politics are, but for anybody who doesn't know, this book is published with Repeater, which is a publishing house co-founded by Mark Fisher, very important leftist thinker, and I strongly identify as a leftist. I'm a socialist, and the abundance thing is, let's deregulate everything but make it sound like it's progressive. So just in the same way that effective altruism is essentially about money and making everything about money, abundance is deregulation disguised as somewhat semi-progressive stuff. So I think, not in Web3 specifically, but like politically, that's where the ball has moved, and that's where they're trying to push it forward.
Amazing. I'm fascinated with effective accelerationism myself. So kind of like on the opposite side. But that's a whole nother talk for a whole nother day.
I mean, accelerationism can mean a lot of different things too.
It
I would
can.
say that like,
can. Yeah.
Again, a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could do a podcast. I've already.
Oh God. Sorry. It's amazing I only did that once.
I already roped in, I think, 2 other people to do a podcast with me. I don't know when I have the time for that, but we'll definitely do that because this is one of my favorite topics. Is just fraud and like what's happening in the world. And so I appreciate all of your work. I also would like to have a PhD in the history of technology, but also don't have the time for that. So I don't know how you got that.
I had the
but
time to be poor in my 20s, and I did that.
It's really cool. So we're really grateful that you were here, and again, really an honor to be a part of that cohort with you, because what an important thing to be able to educate people and be kind of knowledge brokers. So that was an honor for us to be there. If anybody doesn't know, it was just very cool. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, and I do have copies of the book available. I have copies of my first book, Bitcoin is Magic.
Just gonna take this.
With any of those, I also have a bunch of zines that you can have a copy of if you want.
I was going to say, like, I'm just going to read that on the plane. Okay, take care. It's a really good book. And also the Tornado Cash thing.
Oh, yes, I will say.
Maybe,
so just to be very
cool.
specific, just to say, my most recent project is I did a lot of reporting on the criminal trial in fact, I was there, I think basically every day again for the criminal trial of Roman Storm, one of the co-creators of Tornado Cash, who, it's a flip where like this guy, he was on the stand and he's the actual villain. Roman is actually, pretty much the good guy, and the prosecutor's the villain, frankly. And over the next 4 to 5 months, we did win this Octane grant, and we're going to be developing a documentary podcast about Roman Storm, about the trial, about cypherpunk values, about, specifically how the U.S. government is using statutes that don't legally fit the thing that they're trying to do, and all of that stuff. So that is up next.
Amazing. I, on the other hand, won for my Between Two Ferns of crypto. That is in process of being